So welcome. This is the first of our Blue Deal debates when we discuss our seas, our fishing industry and the marine environment. I'm Chris Davies, and this webinar is taking place thanks to the organisation and support of the consultancy Rud Pedersen in Brussels. Today we're going to ask about overfishing, what has to be done to ensure the future is sustainable. That's sustainable both for the fish and for the fishing industry. Of course, the European Commission, who we'll hear from shortly, will say that there's been huge improvements over recent years. But some of the NGOs will be saying, no, it's still as bad as ever. With me, I want to welcome here on the bottom right of your screen, Maya Kirchner, Head of Units for the Northern Seas Division at the European Commission's DG MARE. Maya, I know, was in the cabinet of two separate agriculture and fisheries commissioners for a period of up to 15 years. And 5 years ago, I think, moved over to the 2 years ago. Okay, well, from one minute you were trying to you were trying to devise the levers that had to be pulled, and now you actually have to make the mechanism actually work when politicians pull them.
Yes.
We have Daniel Voces. Daniel, please forgive my appalling Spanish pronunciation. From the managing director of Europeche, the voice of the fishing industry. Daniel's a lawyer by training. He's phoning in from his home in Vigo, which of course is Spain's, in fact, Europe's largest fishing port. So very much with his, well, I suppose I would say you've got the fingers on the pulse, but actually you're inside your house like everyone else.
Yes.
And Rebecca Hubbard, program director for the NGO Our Fish, which concentrates its fire against overfishing and the proper application of the European Union's common fisheries policy. Having spent some years working in the marine environment of Tasmania, I guess, Rebecca, you know the southern seas as well as the northern seas, but we look forward to hearing from you. And by the way, we're not going to touch upon the Mediterranean today. I mean, the issues facing that sea deserves special attention. So I think we're going to have a lively discussion. But if there are issues that anyone watching here thinks are missing, then please submit a question. On the right-hand side, there should be I don't understand these things, but there should be an enable chat button or something. So submit a question through that mechanism. So today was supposed to be the opening launch of the Brussels Seafood Exhibition, biggest seafood exhibition in the world. Thousands of exhibitors just demonstrating the size of this industry. As we know, it's not happening, and it's been cancelled altogether for this year. And most of you will be watching this from home. And many others will be worrying about their future employment. So before we talk about the key issue, Daniel, let me come to you and just say, what is the state of the fishing industry with the virus?
Yes, good question. So yeah, we are facing a terrible and unprecedented crisis in the European Union. But first of all, I would like to start by saying that I'm really proud of our industry and they deserve full credit, because from the very beginning that this started, our fishermen, fully aware of the health crisis, they continue fishing, they continue supplying food to the European market in a very challenging environment. I think that is really important to mention. But yes, we're facing many issues, starting from health and operational problems. We're facing port access restrictions, logistical issues, lack of tests and protective means for our fishermen, such as masks and gloves, difficulties to repatriate our fishermen, and also to perform the crew changes. From a market side, generally, we are facing a fall in demand and in prices of fish, particularly for fresh products. And markets in Europe and globally, they are disrupted and even closed, particularly HoReCa channels for businesses like hotels, restaurants, etc. So in this context, part of the coastal fishing fleets had to tie up in many European countries. But most of the large and distant water fleets, they continue operations, but facing many of the operational issues that I just mentioned, and also loss of income. So per fishing trip, to give you an idea, many vessels are facing a loss of 50% of the revenue. So we needed urgent solutions from the European institutions. We requested them, and we got a quick call from the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council. So I think we need to congratulate the European institutions for adopting a whole legislative package in only 1 month. And if
I may, I mean, one of your press releases describes the response from the European Commission and the Council as extraordinary. And in this case, I mean, you got most of what you wanted, did you not? I mean, it's extraordinarily good for once.
Yeah, of course, the European Commission is enabling the member states and the industry to fully use the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund and the Common Market Organization regulation in order to mitigate the impact. But of course, we still need further measures. For instance, we are requesting to transfer part of our quota available for this year for the next year. Also, we're still facing operational problems, like, for instance, repatriation of fishermen and the use of tests. Also, we are requesting the launch of a seafood promotion campaign to restore the levels of consumption in the European Union, to compensate the loss of income for those fishermen still operating and with facing a loss, and extra funding for those member states who already have exhausted the national operational programs. Because what the European Union is allowing is to fully use the EMFF, but if you don't have any more money, because we are already in 2020, this is still a problem.
So you've got a wish list still.
Yes, of course.
Submitted to the Commission. We'll come on to the quota issue you raised a bit later on. But I mean, also, what about the difference? Two things. First of all, the money has got to come from somewhere, and of course, you're taking if you're using the EMFF money, the fisheries fund money for these purposes, it can't be used for other purposes. And the other question, of course, is that small fishermen are small fishermen able to access the benefits as well as the larger fishing fleets?
Yeah, concerning the first question, as the Commissioner said, the EMFF cannot solve every ocean solution. So, of course, we understand that the European Commission tried to identify the main problems and use the existing money to solve these problems. And then what we're trying to see and identify is other European funding, so from social or transport, etc., that we can use for the fishing industry as well. The second question, of course, small and large scale, they have to benefit from these schemes, but it's up to the member states in the end to decide who is getting what. And now we are in this implementation phase. We are talking to our member states to quickly implement these measures and to try to get the funding for the fishermen that most need this. But there's no differentiation between large or small scale. Of course, under the EMFF, they have priority under the funding schemes. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Okay, let's look at the longer term, and let's hope this crisis is put behind us as quickly as possible. The long term, of course, is the future of our seas, and whether or not we're maintaining the richness, or are we carrying on overfishing. So Maya, the Common Fisheries Policy, adopted in 2013, insists that the maximum sustainable yield exploitation rate should be achieved by 2020 for all stocks. Before you go into that, just what is maximum sustainable yield?
Well, in plain, simple English, I would say it's a principle that allows the fishermen and fisherwomen to take the maximum out of the sea while still keeping the fish stock sustainable in the long run. Okay,
fair enough. Stopping overfishing, plenty of fish for the future. But
exactly.
You're going to. I'm sure you're here, and you're going to tell us if the story is good and things are better. But before we go on to that, if the story is good now and better, it's going to have been worse in the past. Just how bad did things get? I mean, how much were we overfishing?
We were overfishing a lot, and we were actually cutting off the part of the tree that we were sitting on. It's a saying we have in German. I'm translating it into English. I'm not sure if it's clear for everybody. But we were not eating the interests, but we were eating the bank capital that we had saved in the bank. So that was very bad. I'll give you some figures. It was in 2009 only that we only had 5 sustainable fisheries. Can you imagine 5 sustainable fisheries only in the whole Northeast Atlantic under the control of the European Union? And that is, of course, pitiful. So where have we come from that situation in 2009 in as little as 11 years?
Just hold your horses. Daniel, do you recognize that? I mean, we were seriously overfishing?
I think we also need to look at the definition of overfishing, because the standards were changing over time. Before, the standard was the safe biological limits. Then it was increased to FMSY. So if you're not fishing at FMSY, you are overfishing. But of course, there's different interpretations over this.
Well, I mean, I've seen just doing some reading before here, I've seen a figure which says that we actually reached peak landings, peak catches in European waters back in 1975, which suggests that there's been sort of, at the very least, a gradual decline over those years, which, you know, can't have been good for the security and the long-term future of the fishing industry.
Yeah, well, from our perspective, the whole fisheries management changed over after the year 2000. So after the 2000s, we saw a decline in fishing effort, and also as Maria described, the European Commission take matter seriously, and they adopted the common fisheries policy, and we see that situation is better and better. Yeah. Okay,
we'll come back onto Maya. Don't worry about it. Rebecca, if you want to come in and just say this, you know, but we will be coming back onto you, I promise you. But let me bait you though. Okay, you just said that the fishing effort was reduced. That is, fewer money was paid to take boats out of the water in practice, to reduce the size of the fishing fleet, to reduce the amount of fishing that was taking place. And things are now better. But I have to say, Daniel, I don't remember fishermen, you know, beating the drum and saying, "You politicians, you've got to stop us fishing too much. You've got to reduce the quotas to let the fish stocks recover." Fishermen always seem to say, "No, there's no problem."
Yeah, I have to say that fishermen, they are not stupid. I mean, they are not asking for more quota year after year, but what they want is a rational quota. And what do we mean by rational quota? Well, what we want is to fully use the ranges and the quota scenarios provided by scientists to reach MSY objectives at a pace that for us is reachable and doable, and to take into consideration the socio-economic factors and also the reports from member states for the Commission to decide on tax on quotas. So what we want is to maximize the possible catch while preserving the stocks and preserving the industry. So I understand that this is a difficult balance, but this does not mean that we are not accepting rollovers or quota reductions. If necessary, of course, we accept them. Of course, it's also painful. If we cut our quota from one year to another more than 15%, this is unbearable for our fishermen. Imagine that, just put yourself in this situation, that the European Union 1 year increases your salary by 40%, and the next year they reduce your salary by 75%. Can you live like that? I don't think so. So that is why it's really difficult for our fishermen every time that we're negotiating tax and quotas.
Okay. We can appreciate the difficulties. Rebecca, you may want to point out that we are talking about sustainability here and the ecology, and you can't simply conjure up fish out of thin water.
But I think this is potentially a good point just to step in and talk about, if we're talking about sustainability and we're talking about maximum sustainable yield is kind of the bare minimum for sustainable stocks. Any less than maximum sustainable yield, and you've got a declining population. And if you don't have, just as in with your body health, if you're not like healthy and vibrant, if you get a bit of a hit from somewhere else, a bit of virus, or not the coronavirus, but a flu or something else, I mean, you're more vulnerable to that impact. And so the problem that we have, if we're constantly managing our fish stocks at this bare minimum or below the bare minimum, is that then you have more vulnerability to escalating and drastically decreasing scientific advice, because the stock in itself is not as healthy and robust. And in terms of actually what you get out of a fishery and a fish population, if it's bigger and healthier and it has good size structure in terms of a range of ages and sizes within the population, then you get much better interest, as Maya pointed out before. The interest that you can cream off the top of that growing and healthy population is much higher. So economically, it's actually better to have a sustainable fish population, and it's more security because you don't get so much fluctuation.
All right, but you've described MSY there as the minimum, and indeed we've heard from Maya that we were down to just, because of the overfishing that we'd allowed, down to just 5 fish stocks were being fished at this minimum, what you describe as the minimum sustainable level. But Maya, how many fish stocks are we talking about, by the way? What's 5 out of how many? How many fish stocks are we measuring?
Well, at the time, of course, you can't say 5 out of 100 or 5 out of 200. It's not 5 out of all the fish stocks in EU waters, but 5 out of the number where we knew what is actually maximum sustainable yield. I have to admit, I don't have the figure off the top of my head of how much MSY advice we had actually in 2009. We would have to check that. But to give you a ballpark figure on where we are today, so today we receive MSY, solid MSY advice for 78 fish stocks in EU waters, and the other fish stocks have precautionary advice.
Okay, so now, give us some good news then. You've been waiting to give us the good news. Go on.
Now, of the 7, I think 70. We have quotas. We, the EU, we have quota shares in 78 MSY stocks or MSY advice stocks in the EU. But of the 78, there are a number which don't control ourselves, but we manage together with the coastal states. So these are Iceland, Russia, Norway, the Faroe Islands, and there are others that we manage between Norway and the Union. And as you know, in the near future, we will have a lot of stocks, which we will even have less stocks that we control ourselves, and more stocks that will be managed by the future EU-Norway UK arrangements, because the UK is, of course, no longer part of the common fisheries policy and the Union. So let me just give you the picture for the EU-only stocks, because these are the ones that the EU ministers control fully. And here the figures are actually quite good. So we have 47 tax managed at MSY, and when I say at MSY, it means either at the MSY point or even below, because we have a number of them in the MSY lower range, and we have very few in the MSY upper range, out of 53 MSY advice stocks. So where have we not achieved MSY? It's 6 tax only, 6 tax. And here I would actually like to cite an ICES scientist, actually the chair of ACOM, Mark Dickey Collas, a very renowned European scientist, who has repeatedly said that from a biological point of view, it is not possible to manage all fish stocks at MSY at the same time. Now, that should not be used as an excuse not to strive for it, obviously, and that's what we're doing. We're striving for management towards as much as possible 100%. But there are cases where you have a fish stock which is MSY assessed, but it's a bycatch in another fishery, in another sustainable fishery. So these are very difficult situations. So what are we doing for these 6 fish stocks? We're putting in place recovery measures, remedial measures. We're putting in place measures additional to tax, to quota management. So, for example, areas, we're telling them where to fish, where not to fish, what kind of nets to use. And these are very important measures, and we hope that these measures will bear fruit soon. It depends which fish stock we're talking about.
Right. Some of those details we can come back onto. But I think, so we've gone from 5 to...
I can't hear you.
Okay. Can you not hear me, Maya?
Yeah, now I can hear you again.
Okay,
yeah.
So we've gone from 5, over the past decade or two, we've gone from 5 fish stocks at MSY to about 53, did you say, under purely EU control. And then we've got shared stocks with Norway, and of course we've got the elephant in the room, Brexit and all that coming up. But okay, some good progress. How are we doing with Norway? Because we share how many stocks with Norway?
We share 18 tax. 18, so we count the tax. There are less stocks, but 18 tax. And of the 18, we did a pretty big jump towards the positive side from last year to this year. We're now managing 15 out of 18 in line with MSY. So the cooperation between Norway and the EU is quite good. It's 3 particular cases where we haven't achieved MSY, and I think they are known to everybody. It's the 3 North Sea cod stocks, where we received a very bad advice, very negative ICES advice last year for a very, very large decrease. the scientists told us if we want to fish this stock sustainably, we have to decrease by 71%. And in the end, the agreement was to decrease by 50%. So it's still quite a big decrease, but we are not managing it at MSY.
Well, we can come back. Good. Okay. Quick point to Daniel, first of all. Okay, so there's a positive story there, and that positive story is reflected by the fishing industry, by more fish being caught, bigger profits. Is that the case? I mean, before the virus, of course.
Yes. Well, I have one comment before that about what Rebecca said, that if we are not fishing at MSY level, the stocks are declining. Well, actually, we need to look at the recruitment of the stock, and also fishing pressure, etc. Because sometimes even if we fish with a little higher pressure on the stock still rebuilding and recovery, etc. Also, I fully agree with the analysis of Maya on the good progress. And I think that we should mention that this is not a coincidence, or it's just something fortunate. It happened because 22,000 fishing vessels disappeared over the last 20 years. The part was with the commissioning schemes, but part is because people went out of business. And of course, we had a huge reduction in fishing pressure, but also we have reduced our greenhouse emissions. We have reduced our waste. We have participated in fishing quality schemes. We have reduced our footprint, also freeze the footprint in FMOs, and we are closely collaborating with scientists. And this also is benefiting the fisheries management. So
you're actually saying that besides the fact there's been some serious political measures taken to reduce the size of the fishing fleet to ensure that we're fishing, we're not simply overfishing any longer, but also that there's been a change in attitude amongst fishermen, amongst the fishing companies, so the recognition that they've got to fish sustainably for the long term.
Yeah. I think the whole fishing industry now is really they change behavior, and also the market is demanding for sustainable products. So of course we change behavior, and we're trying to do things better and operating in a sustainable manner. And actually, also this is caused by the acceptance of the taxon quotas. Our fishermen, they have been respecting the decisions made in Brussels, and they're respecting the quotas that are decided in Brussels. So that's why now we have a better better situation.
Respecting decisions made in Brussels. That's well. I'm in the UK at the moment, so you know how that's. Anyway, I'm glad about that. Just one thing, Rebecca, just before we move on. Maya talked about the shared stocks and good progress, and we tend to think of Norway, of course, as a partner that's committed to sustainability. But I have seen you being very critical of Norway. You wrote just at the end of last year, Norway has invested a great deal in projecting itself as an anti-overfishing champion, when in actual fact it is hypocritical. You say the quota's way above sustainable levels. Do you want to quickly come back on Norway? We'll come back on the other ones later on.
Yeah, sure. I mean, on Norway, it's an interesting point. Definitely, the EU and Norway came to a much better outcome for 2020 fishing limits than they had the year before. The year before was actually the worst outcome on record, and last year was a significant improvement. What I think is really, there's a couple of things worth noting with Norway, and I think they propose a real challenge going forward for the EU as well, particularly in light of Brexit. One is that it's an extremely non-transparent process. So the council decision-making process for our annual packs is already non-transparent. We know that the Agrifish Council makes decisions, and the EU Ombudsman has already criticised the lack of transparency and encouraged other measures to improve that. With Norway, it's even worse. It's an EU delegation with industry representatives and a Norway delegation with industry representatives, and they go into buildings for some days on end and then come out at the other end. NGOs have been completely rejected to be able to participate in the same way as industry, and of course that raises some concerns for us. And it's therefore, it really raises questions about, or certainly you can understand why then you would come out with overfishing at the end of those processes. But I think one of the things that's most important to reflect on with last year in terms of the North Sea cod and the stocks that Maya suggested is in 2018, when they were deciding the fishing limits for for 2019. The scientific advice for North Sea cod was also a huge cut. It was 50% more or less. And the industry and everyone else said, no, it's too much. We can't do it. We'll only do 30% or 35% cut. And then when it got to 2019, of course, the scientists said, well, the stock is in a worse state. And now we're proposing a 70% cut. And then again, oh, it's too much. It's too hard. So we'll take a 50% cut. And I get that okay, we're meant to be doing these things progressively. And for sure, we need to do things in a way that this is a fair and a relatively.
Well, let me cut in, Rebecca, because I don't know whether to go to Maya or to Daniel. I mean, Rebecca's making the point. You say, the fishing industry can't bear a cut that big, but by not accepting it, you end up with a worse situation the following year. Who wants to? Daniel, do you want to respond, or Maya? Simply, I take it you're just going to say, well, that's right. But go on, Daniel.
No, I could say that the situation of the cod stocks is not mainly due to the fishing pressure, but we also need to take into account other factors like climate change that and our scientists, they are recognizing this, and also pollution. And in the case of the North Sea, they also saw that there's a change in the patterns of the fishing operations due to the landing obligation. So they see that there are things going on. It's not only due to the fishing pressure, which, by the way, has been reduced over the years. But the problem is that we have poor recruitment. And that is a huge problem. And if we combine this with the landing obligation, then you have a choke species for all fisheries in the European Union. So what do? Do we stop fishing? So that is the main problem.
Let's have a quick look at this decision-making process that Rebecca's touched upon. The setting of the annual catch limits, the total allowable catches, the tax, which are, I think there's a process. The ministers, usually they're agricultural ministers, I think, aren't they, who've become fisheries ministers for this one meeting. And they meet every year in December, and there's separate meetings for the Baltic and Norway that's been mentioned. How does this meeting work? Maya, you've been at these things, presumably. Daniel, you've probably been at them too, because you're allowed in for some reason, whereas the NGOs are not, nor the MEPs, I think, ex-MEPs. Maya, how does this process work? And have you seen it change over the years? Has the attitude of the ministers changed? Because it used to be said that the fishing industry used to, dictate the ministers didn't really take any notice of the scientific advice or the Commission's proposals.
No, it's very fair to say that the attitude of the member states and the ministers who represent them in the Fisheries Council has definitely changed. I personally saw a marked change as of, I would say, 2010 December Council. What was that change? I've been in these negotiations since 1995 in various functions, not always in the same function. But in the first years, ministers would negotiate by saying, "Oh well, on this sole stock in the Channel, I need 500 tons more. Can we increase the tag by 500 tons?" And there was no citing of scientific advice. There was no citing of economic evidence why this was needed. These were how the negotiations went. What has changed in 2010 was that ministers started to look at scientific advice. Their staff looked at it, but they underpinned their requests with the science. And this was a new thing. So this was virtually, I would say, almost 180-degree turn from how the negotiations took place before. And because they had to look at the scientific advice, the requests also had to adjust. It wasn't possible anymore to just say, I need 500 tons more here or there, but they had to look, well, where does the stock or the science actually offer something? And of course, there are ways how you can read the scientific advice. Often, we are in situations where member states will argue, well, let me interrupt you.
Let's talk about the cod example that's just been given to us. You recommended. Okay, you're saying for the most part the ministers are signing up to your recommendations, and your recommendations are based upon the scientific advice. But you said we needed a 70% cut in North Sea cod, and the ministers only allowed us 50%. And, you know,
Well, actually,
and this decision is taken behind closed doors, and there's nothing in the minutes that explains why the scientific advice wasn't followed. And, you know, it's still a closed shop arrangement.
If I can interrupt you on this one, that example is not ideal because the North Sea Cod is one of the EU-Norway tax. So on the North Sea Cod, the EU position was actually exactly the ICES advice, and not 1%, not even 1 ton below. That's what we tried to get from the EU-Norway negotiations. And I will stop here. You know what the result is. It wasn't minus 71%. So obviously it wasn't the EU's doing. That's all I will say. But we can't dictate to Norway. Norway is an equal partner. And, you know, we can say, and we've tried very hard until the very end to hold out. And let me tell you, it is only because we held out, our chief negotiator held out until the week before the council to get the agreement. And it was that reason that actually pushed Norway to accept, you know, as high a cut as 50%, even if it wasn't the full ICES advice. So there you go. I've probably said already much more than I should have said diplomatically. Another example, ministers not accepting MSY. Actually, if you look at it today, from the stocks that we manage ourselves, they've accepted every single MSY advice that we have proposed. In some cases, they increased the proposal a little bit, but never above MSY. And why is that? Why is that possible? It's only possible because that is the law today. So there are only 6 cases, in only 6 cases where of the stocks that we manage ourselves, have we not achieved MSY. And I'm happy to give the reason, but you know, it's going to get quite technical.
Okay. I see.
All the others, MSY is achieved.
All right. But that's all good. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, that's all good news. It means it's progress. Rebecca, were you waving at your kids, or did you want to come in? I still know you criticise the whole overfishing, and I will give you a platform to explain your views in more detail in a few minutes. But did you just want to come in on the decision making process here?
Well, I was going to clarify that I was obviously talking before about the EU-Norway decision, but I do think that the numbers of stocks, we do need to have a bit of a discussion about what's following scientific advice, because I know that Maya keeps referring to there's only 6 stocks above MSY advice, but we're really talking about like a percentage of the total number of fish stocks that are being managed.
Okay, we talked about the numbers. How many fish stocks could we be? Maya says we've got details for 78 fish stocks at the moment. How many could we have if the scientists studied everything?
So as far as I'm aware, the EU has a stake in around 120 or over 120 fish stocks and fishing limits, annual fishing limits. And so and I think the thing that we need to keep returning to and keep in the top of our minds is that the EU Common Fisheries Policy, it says that it will, Article 2 says it will take a precautionary approach to fisheries management, and that they will ensure the exploitation of marine resources restores and maintains our fish populations so that they can be harvested at sustainable levels. And yes, that's at MSY, but where you don't have MSY, you should follow the precautionary scientific advice. And the thing that is very challenging is that the Commission continues to only cite the number of fish stocks that have MSY advice when there are, according to Maya, and I don't know their numbers exactly, another 40 or so that have scientific advice. And just one point here, which I think is worth mentioning, Chris, is that the EU's Scientific Technical Expert Committee on Fisheries, just released their report, and it still says that something like 38 or 39% of tax are over the MSY, or over scientific advice. That's what the STEC report says for 2020. So I think...
Okay, Maya, I'm going to come back to you in a minute to respond, but I need to say that we're at the halfway point of this, the first of our Blue Deal debates. It's been made possible thanks to the team at the Wood Pedersen Consultancy in Brussels. Normally, of course, we might be having a lunchtime meeting in Brussels in a nice meeting room, but on this occasion, you have to provide your own sandwiches, so it saves money and we can all enjoy the afternoon. Now, this webinar is going to be available for those who've registered pretty well immediately. This is over, and it's going to be on YouTube from about this time tomorrow. if you want to be kept in the loop and to register for the next Blue Deal debate, and indeed the whole series, then I'm told that thanks to the miracles of technology, a button should appear on the right-hand side, which will allow you to register and express your interest. I'm also told you can submit some questions using the chat button if you wish. But now let's get back to our discussion about overfishing. And in case anyone has just joined us recently, we have Maya Kirshner on the bottom right from the European Commission, Rebecca Hubbard from the NGO Overfish, and Daniel Voces from Europeche, Managing Director of Europeche, the voice of the fishing industry. Now, Rebecca, you've already put to Maya this, well, you've challenged the Commission really, that the way in which they present the figures is far too optimistic and it doesn't get down to the details. So there's a lot of fish stocks that simply aren't being taken proper account of. Is that a fair criticism, Maya?
Rebecca refers to the fish stocks where we receive precautionary advice from ICES. And it's true that a number of these precautionary tags, here what we do is we look at what the ICES advice actually says, what its basis is, how much information is available. Does ICES have information on how much the fishing pressure is? Do they know how much the stock is reproducing every year? Do they have information on other factors? Do they have information on how much fish is actually in the sea of that particular stock? And the problem that we see is that there are among the precautionary advice tags too many examples where in the first top, in the head, what we call the headline advice, ICES will say, well, we would advise in order to fish precautionary to not fish more than, let's say, 3,000 tons. But then if you read through the advice, on the same page in the bottom, you say there on the biomass of that fish stock, ? So that means ICES.
Oops. That's just you, Maya, jammed. You jammed. Rebecca, you're still there?
Fish coming in, so new year classes again, ? ICES can. And I'll give you a very concrete example, and it's frustrating for us, believe you me. There's a very concrete example, pollock in the Atlantic, where ICES told us, sorry, I just have to put my password to avoid that you lose me here.
It's good that the Commission here, the European Commission, has the least effective technology. You know.
So we had an example last year, pollock in the Atlantic.
We'll come back to you, Maya. I'm going to throw a question at you, Daniel, while Maya's getting sorted. And this is a hard one because you said earlier on, right at the beginning, when we were talking about the difficulties being faced by the fishing industry because of the virus, that in addition to the financial measures that have been agreed, you were calling for an additional 25% of, for basically fishermen to be allowed to catch more fish, 25% more fish next year to compensate for the problems they've had at the moment. I mean, we've heard at the moment there's more attention is being paid to the scientific advice. That just disregards it, surely. I mean, you're just saying, oh, well, it doesn't matter if the fish don't breed more because human beings are suffering a virus. We just want 25% more fish. Surely you have got to follow the scientific advice.
Yes. Before replying to that question, I would like to comment on the transparency during the council negotiations. Actually, I think there's been a big change because ministers, they're also meeting with NGOs. I saw them in the town hotel, they're meeting with the industry, and then they also want to get feedback from NGOs. So I think there's been a big change on that side. Now, concerning the quota flexibility inter-year, so this is something that is already foreseen in the Common Fisheries Policy. So we can ask for a 10% of the unused quota for a given year to use it for the next year. We can already transfer 10% of our quota for next year. This is already happening. The thing is that for major fisheries, so for some species, I'm going to give you an example. Blue whiting is happening, the fishery is taking place nowadays, and it's a seasonal activity. And we're talking about 400,000 tons EU quota. So what are we going to do with the excess of quota that we cannot market because the African market is shut down, and the storage aid that is providing is really helpful. but we're talking about thousands of tons. So we have limited space for storage, and the price is increasing. So our fishermen, what they're saying is like, why don't we leave the fish in the sea this year and then fish it for the next year? Of course, this requires an advice from ICES, and this has been done already in 2014 and 15 when we had the Russian ban on seafood products, and also we had Nigerian market disruptions. So in that case, also the Commission allowed us to use up to 25% for the next year. It doesn't mean that we are requesting 25% increase for all products and for all fish species. What it means is that we're asking the Commission that, provided there's a positive scientific advice, to allow us to use for the next year up to 25%. It could be 16%, it could be 19%.
What do you think of that, Rebecca?
Well, I mean, it's definitely our view, and that of all NGOs, I believe, that a TAC rollover should certainly not be increased above 10%, and that if the population experiences an increase as a result of the lack of fishing, a decrease in fishing effort, then the scientific advice would reflect that, and that MSY is MSY, like the fishing, a sustainable fishing limit is sustainable, and the scientific advice should reflect that for next year. So that is certainly our position. I would also add that, it does raise also a concern specifically that if the industry is asking for compensation because it is experiencing impact from the COVID crisis, that then it would receive compensation for that, but then it would also get to have more fishing next year. So that is raises some questions for us. But regardless, based on the science, we would say ask ICES for their advice for the fishing limit for 2021, and that's what should be the limit for 2021.
Right. Well, Maya was trying to respond to some of your criticisms before when the line broke up. But we've heard Maya talk about and with Daniel's agreement that the state of the stocks is better now than it has been for a good while. And yet, I look at the press releases which the NGOs put out after the latest December deal, and they're bitterly critical. I mean, Pew Trust said the limits agreed by ministers suggest that the progress to end overfishing has stalled or even reversed. Seas at Risk said ministers decided to breach the law allowing overfishing beyond 2020. This decision represents a betrayal of European citizens. And you said, or at least you were quoted, the fisheries ministers refused to follow scientific advice. It demonstrated shocking ignorance of the biodiversity crisis. They're just not getting it. I mean, Maya, you must feel you can't win. I mean, things are improving and you still get battered. Is that fair?
That's it. Yes, that's very fair. That's very fair. And if I may, it's a little bit frustrating. We do acknowledge on the precautionary advice tags that the tags are not all of them are set in line with what the headline figure said. And I was trying to explain before what actually, happens in council. I've given that particular example of that pollock fish. On that stock, we had actually proposed quite a big decrease. We proposed to decrease the tag by 40% because we wanted to move towards that advice figure. But then the relevant member state said, but look, I mean, if you read the ICES advice, so yes, they say that's the figure in the headline, but they only rely on the landing figures. So ICES at the same time says we don't know how much fishing pressure is exerted on that stock. We don't know how much fish is in the sea, and we can't tell you much. So in these situations, it's virtually impossible for the Commission to achieve a decrease and to move closer towards the scientific advice. What are we doing to remedy this situation? We are working with ICES, with the scientists, to help them give us more MSY advice, and we're concentrating first on those stocks which are target fisheries in EU water. So where we have the bigger quotas, like this pollock stock, for example, in the Atlantic. So in other words, I hope that this situation will not go on forever. For sure, we need more MSY advice, where we today only receive precautionary advice. But I think it's also important to be honest. We will never have MSY advice for all stocks. Why is that the case? Because the scientists, of course, concentrate on those stocks where the most landings come from, and the ones which are targeted.
Well, the common fisheries policy specifically refers to harvested species. So those are the fish we actually eat, I suppose. I mean, it doesn't pay perhaps sufficient regard to the wider marine environment. It has a commercial bias.
That's it. It's the one. These are the species that we want to catch. But then, of course, we don't only catch what we want to get in the net, but there's also, because we have mixed fisheries in Europe, there's also a lot of other fish that get caught in the net. And it is these are the famous bycatches. On most of the bycatches, we get precautionary advice. Where we have MSY advice, we propose the MSY advice figure. In all cases, or we propose a figure which is in line with MSY lower, where we have for stocks covered by a plan, by a multi-annual plan. But let me just say to Rebecca and to the audience as well, once again, we are working together with ICES to try and receive more MSY advice every year. And we do see an improvement. So from one year to the next, there are sometimes a handful of cases, sometimes more, where ICES is able to give us better advice. So they're going from precautionary to MSY advice. Okay. But there's also the reverse. Let me just say that. There's also the reverse. Sometimes something happens in the sea that the scientists can't explain. And then because they are scientists, because they want to be careful, they change an MSY assessed stock to a precautionary assessed stock. So that's how we also lose MSY.
Okay. All right, Rebecca, I take it, despite my eloquence, I take it you're not completely satisfied with that answer. I mean, they're simply not measuring all the fish you want them to measure. They're not taking account of these things. So what's your shopping list? What do you want? What changes do you want from the Commission, or indeed from European Union?
Well, I think we just, once again, let's just step back 1 minute and take a look at the situation. In 2013, the Common Fisheries Policy was reformed to aim to end overfishing by the latest 2020 for all fish stocks, including those that are all harvested. And that includes fish that aren't target species. There's still a stock that have a management level. I mean, we made this commitment. I also think we need to also maybe remember that we're in the middle of a climate and nature crisis, and the EU is making very big commitments internationally and around Europe that we're going to do everything we can to change our relationship with nature and to make sure that we stop destroying the ecosystems that support us. And that absolutely fundamentally for our planet and our ocean includes ending overfishing, because healthy ocean is critical. So I think that in terms of my perspective, I think there's three things that we really need to do going forward. And one of them is just to reinstate that the Common Fisheries Policy is fit for purpose. What was done in 2013 was ambitious. It was very much needed. It was very much it's still relevant. Okay, we need all tax, still all fishing limits, still following that scientific advice. But I think one thing that has not been implemented, that it is still needed, is the allocation or prioritization of allocation of quotas to the most environmentally and socially beneficial parts of the fleet. That is still not being addressed.
You mean the small scale fishermen who are probably the low impact fishermen, they're environmentally low impact. They get very little out of the Common Fisheries Policy, and that's really partly because of decisions about the allocation are made at a national level when it comes down to these things. So there's nothing the MARE can do about that. Well,
I mean, the Commission could use its position to actually ask for reports on the implementation of Article 17, as she knows very well, on the allocation. It could also use various processes to actually push member states along, and we haven't done that, and that's a big item that would really help to transition our fisheries into a more sustainable form of fisheries going forward. And the other two things that I think we
very quickly go on.
Very forward is about getting an environmental impact assessment of these fishing activities on the broader marine ecosystem, on biodiversity, on protected species, on habitats, because it is the biggest impact on our ocean, and it's not being assessed for its ecosystem impacts or being managed. And then finally, ending overfishing and actually delivering on sustainable fisheries should be in our climate laws and in our climate regulation, because the ocean is a huge contributor to climate mitigation and adaptation.
Okay, well, we can start. You've criticised some of the ways in which overfishing is measured, and I think Daniel has too. I just wondered, this does seem to me there's a fair bit of common ground here. I mean, in the aspirations of you all, be it fishing industry, environmentalists, and the policymakers, I mean, you're all going in a similar direction, I think. Well, at least you're not spitting blood at each other. Okay, no, we're
could I come in?
Please,
Could I come in? Because I'd like to respond to something that Rebecca had said. And it's something that I see being cited repeatedly by the NGO, by our NGO colleagues. The NGOs tend to look only at the basic regulation. But you do not look at the multi-annual plans that we have put in place. And that's very important, because these multi-annual plans are, from a legal perspective, at the same level with the basic regulation. They are the constitution. Together with the CFP regulation, multi-annual plans form the constitution of EU fisheries management. Why do I mention these multi-annual plans? Because there are very important rules in there that we as Commission cannot choose if we want to follow them or we don't want to follow them. We have to follow them. So what is this? Are these rules that I'm talking about? There's a very important rule which was agreed between the European Parliament, the representative of the citizens, and the Council of Ministers, and that rule says, yes, MSY for all stocks, but where you have a situation where fishing everything at MSY would mean that you choke, that leads to choke situations, you have to take this into account. So in plain English, what does it mean? Let's look at the Atlantic and the current situation. We have an MSY there, an MSY advice stock, Celtic Sea cod. ISA says zero fishing if you want to fish sustainably. If we had put a zero tag for that, we could have closed down all Atlantic fishing for demersal species. So that means Portuguese fleets, Spanish fleets, French, Irish, UK, Belgium, Dutch fleets stay in the port. All demersal vessels, because you cannot avoid catching cod to 100%. You can put in place more selective gears, and that's exactly what we have done in the last December Council. And I think that's what needs to be read as well, and that's what needs to come out of the press statements from the NGOs. It's not just the figures. It's not just quotas. Please look at the flanking measures that we have put in place. They're very important.
Well, perhaps you can all get together, Daniel, in the Ton Hotel. I noticed you mentioned this as an example of transparency, that instead of actually allowing the NGOs and things into the meeting where the decisions are made, you can meet down the road around the bar. However, I think that might come back to haunt you. You wanted to come in, and indeed I've got a series of questions here, but we're running out of time. I would ask our participants here if they will look at the questions afterwards and respond to those who've submitted them. Daniel, come in and respond, but also give us your wish list. What does the fishing industry want from the Commission, from the European Union over the next few years, in addition to the crisis measures?
All right. Well, thank you for that. Before that, I would like to comment briefly on what is being discussed now concerning Rebecca's comment that the common fisheries policy is fit for purpose. I mean, Maya just mentioned that scientists are saying that we cannot fish all stocks at MSY levels, and still we have an article in the common fisheries policy that says that you have to have all stocks fished at MSY level. So actually, of course,
we actually should be going above MSY. Perhaps Maya can tell us about that, what above means at some point. Sorry, Daniel, I interrupted you.
No worries. But the thing is, scientists say it is not possible. So we have a rule in the common fisheries policy that is not achievable. And that gives the impression to the consumers and to the European Union citizens that we are not sustainable. And that is a problem. We need rational policies in the common fisheries policy. And then when they refer to the environmental impact assessments, we have the common fisheries policy, but we also have the Maritime Strategy Framework Directive. And in there, I have participated myself in many meetings, and the best studied industry is the fisheries industry, because, for instance, we have all these descriptors about the state of the fish stocks, but when we talk about noise underwater or the impact of the seabed, of wind farms, etc., they're just starting to check the environmental impact of this industry. So that is the main problem for us. And this impression that we are not operating sustainably, and these doom and gloom messages from the NGO community, the problem is that it's not only frustrating the industry, as Maya was saying, but also creating an ambience of mistrust. So our companies that are investing in sustainability, now they are asking, why should I collaborate with the government? Why should I collaborate with the European Union or with NGOs? I'm going to be criticized anyway. So that is a big problem. And when it comes to the consumers, they also get the impression that everything is bad and wrong, that we're doing the bad thing. And I think that is not fair, bearing in mind that the good trend that we have in the European Union. Now, concerning the wish list.
Just quickly, Rebecca, go on. Admit it. Things are better than they were 10 years ago.
Well, things are better because the industry was in massive decline and the fish stocks were collapsing. And, yes, it's better than it was because it was a complete disaster. And it was bad.
Okay. But it's not good enough. Right, Daniel, your
That's not our role. I mean, how can anyone... let's be reference point.
You've got to give them a break, though, haven't you? Come on, Daniel, your wish list.
So short term, yes, it's the COVID crisis and Brexit. Then we also believe it's time for implementation. We have recently adopted the multi-annual plans, the technical measure regulation, the sustainable management of external fishing fleets. We also have 2 ongoing negotiations of 2 important files, the EMFF and the control and EU regulation. And for the next steps, yes, we have identified climate change as a direct problem on fisheries management, which will cause, for instance, changes in the species distribution, alien species, and also productivity losses. However, we do not think that this is the right time to change the FMSY policy. We cannot come up with new ideas like economic MSY or BMSY that is promoted by certain groups, because otherwise the fishing industry will get the impression that we are all the time climbing a mountain. We started in this, as I mentioned before, these.
Okay.
But we climbing a mountain that we're never gonna get there to sustainability, and I believe that it is already difficult enough to achieve MSY levels for all the stocks, as Maya was saying.
Well, I think we're really running out of time. But you've just opened up another area altogether, which I'd love to spend more time on, which is what comes next. I mean, Rebecca described MSY as the absolute minimum. And there are, of course, other concepts like maximum economic yield, which you touched, where trying to increase the abundance, more fish in the seas, easier to catch, less fuel being spent by trawler operators in order to catch the fish. These things need discussion. And I would love to have the opportunity to do so. So I hope if these webinars are able to continue for a good time, we'll come back to this and invite you again.
And one last important factor.
Okay, Daniel.
But it's the social perspective. We need a common fisheries policy that is taking care of our fishermen, because one of the main problems in the European industry nowadays is the lack of generational change, and still a high rate of accidents. So we need to take care of the health, safety, training, and working conditions of our fishermen, and also the impact of the fisheries policies from a social perspective.
And of course, we have the elephant in the room, when we're talking about sustainability, which is Brexit, and whether or not we will have an agreement which ensures that there is access for European vessels and there is the principles of sustainability are genuinely complied with by all parties. And who knows what the outcome of that will be. I think the negotiations on fisheries restarted again today, taking place in parallel with our discussion here. We have come to the end. We have a whole series of questions I've not even touched upon, but I hope we'll be able to display them on some form and respond to them properly. I want to thank Maya Kirchner from the European Commission, Rebecca Hubbard from the NGO Overfish, and Daniel Voces from Europeche, and the team, the consultancy Ruud Pedersen in Brussels, who've made this possible. This webinar will be available to watch again if you've registered, I think almost immediately, and it'll be on YouTube from this time tomorrow. And if you want to keep in the loop, then I am told it is possible on this screen here to register for future events. And please do. And let us also have your thoughts about some of the topics that need to be covered, but there's not going to be a shortage of them, I think. I think what's already clear, though, is that while we all say we want sustainable policies, a lot of people would actually welcome closer dialogue between the various interests, between the policymakers, between the environmentalists, between the industry. And I hope we'll find ways of bringing you more together outside the Ton Hotel and turning this into this concept into practice. Our next Blue Deal debate is in 2 weeks' time on May the 5th. And we plan to look at what is taking place across the world, how we need to bring the oceans of our world under proper governance. And we're going to explore the idea of whether the big fish processing companies, billion-dollar companies, can play a leading role in promoting sustainability. So join us, please, in 2 weeks' time. Register now. I hope you've enjoyed today's debate. Thank you all. Keep safe. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Good.